Um, well, um, I was just thinking, any sometimes my teachers, and sort of everybody else under the sun will make an argument that religion all teaches ultimately the same thing. They're all, it's just different ways of teaching the same lessons, or there is a thread of continuity that connects all the various spiritual traditions of the world. There's certain basic core teachings like do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And you find, when you look at various traditions, that there's certain key, core, essential messages that come up again and again. And those essential teachings that you find all over the world, globally, even in communities that are not connected to each other, then you've discovered the essence of religious expression. Did you guys follow that? And this isn't just in the study of religion, but like there's the whole monomyth thing, where Joseph T. Campbell apparently read all the religious traditions of the world and they all had a basic structure to their narratives. It's actually not true. You could find all sorts of disparate traditions. He just found ones that he liked, and then the ones that didn't fit his mold, he sort of screwed them into his mold. I think he came up with some cool stuff, but it's not like it wasn't a clean fit. But anthropologists, sociologists, this is what they look for. They look for, even beyond human society, just looking at, common features of plants, common features of animals, things which are true all over the place, like geometry, gravity. You're looking for these fundamental forces that govern everything, these fundamental particles that make up everything, rules, principles. That's kind of what you do when you're looking at something. When you're trying to get a handle on what's going on in there. You encounter a bunch of stuff. When I say stuff, what do I mean? Whatever. Stuff is, that's why I use the word stuff. You encounter a bunch of people, a bunch of animals, a bunch of plants, a bunch of music, a bunch of geography. You go to a bunch of countries. You look at a bunch of chemicals. You look at any phenomena in the world, and it's like it's just a bunch of stuff. And then our nature, because we have huge brains, we then begin to categorize and compartmentalize, and we try to figure out what ties it all together. Now, you need to do that to survive. Optical illusions work because our brain is designed to see patterns, fill in blanks, so that it can make quick decisions. And so when we see a pattern, our brain fills in the rest of the pattern, even if it's not there, and that's how the optical illusions work. And so animals also see patterns. You need to do that so you can figure out what's dangerous and where food is and where water is and when to run and when to play dead and when to fight back. This stuff is critical to just survival of life. Anticipating danger, anticipating a threat, anticipating a source of nutrition, anticipating a way to procreate. These things are just, they're instinctual. Human beings being so smart compared to other life forms. We're really good at it. And so we encounter a bunch of stuff in the world, and then when you see the stuff, you immediately start to categorize it and compartmentalize it and taxonomize it to figure out how it's all connected together. Think about it. Don't you do that? Like, if you go to prison, there's a whole way that prisons operate and prisons work. And if you don't know, and you're new, then it's like a steep learning curve. You gotta figure it out. It's like beekeeping. There's certain things in life where you do them and you got to figure it out really quick, because if you don't figure it out really quick, you're going to have problems. But whether the learning curve is steep and necessary and there's a precipitous drop-off if you blow it, or whether it's just there is no real danger, our nature is to figure it out. Get good at stuff. Learn movement patterns, which really means learn mental patterns. Your body doesn't learn. Your mind learns, and it's connected to your body. That's how it works. And it becomes a major neural pathway instead of a lesser neural pathway. And then you can access it automatically because it becomes automated. We're really good at this stuff. And we're so smart, we can do it with philosophy and ideas and cultures. So I think there's value in that, looking for the essential features of a religion or of religion in general, or of any religion, the things they have to figure out. I think there's value in that. And there's a deity and a self and the world and how those things are connected. I think that stuff is great. It gives you a map that you can then use to begin to navigate the stuff that you encounter. At least it's a starting place. Problem is, reductionism ends up lumping things together out of necessity. Because when you look at a bunch of stuff, there'll always be some nuances of each individual item in that group. Each tree produces a different flower or a different fruit, or even within the same, they might be a larger or a smaller tree growing in this climate or that climate, with cement blocking the growth of the roots, or enough water or not enough water. And these kind of details then make each plant individual, each person with their own set of fingerprints. Sometimes you compare one thing to another thing to help to better understand it, and the person you're talking to wants to argue with you. So they'll find something They'll find something that doesn't match up. But analogies never match up perfectly because it's analogous. It's not exactly the thing you're describing. So what you got to ask yourself is, does it have enough things in common or big enough items in common that it's illuminating and it's value, it has value and it's illustrative? Did you guys follow that? So sometimes you get these situations, you're probably like this sometimes. You get real nitpicky because you don't want to concede the point. So you find some little thing that's wrong just to keep the argument going unnecessarily, ad nauseum. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Okay? That's the bad side of individualism. The good side of individualism is any attempt to fully reduce something ends up cutting corners because you got to lump stuff together. And so Campbell inevitably had to force a few square pegs into round holes to come up with the monomyth. There's always going to be some outliers. When you get a really good philosopher, they own the outliers. And then they quantify them and they weigh them versus the common points. And they give you kind of a strong or weak argument, and they present how, what statistics would normally show in terms of variance and how there's much less here. And so this is a general principle, and here are the outliers we found, and here's why this is still a good heuristic or rule of thumb or principle. Are you guys following this? Have I lost you? Raise your hand if I lost you. Don't lie to me. All right. Let me just start over again. Lots of people say all religions teach the same thing. You heard that? Okay, good. I even say that. My gurus say that. And every other New Age freakazoid on the planet says it too. So I want to be able to hate them, but not be a hypocrite. And so this class is designed for me to throw some shade on all those hippie-esque, New Age, nonsensical ignoramuses without being a hypocrite because I say the same stuff. So this entire class is an attempt by me to do that. You follow that? So now I got to navigate that. You follow? There's the gorge. I got to navigate it without crashing my hovercraft on either wall of the gorge. On Tatooine. And so when you try to, it's natural to take stuff and try to figure out what ties it all together, what the common threads are. Animals do it, we do it. It's necessary for survival, and we have these huge brains, so we're especially going to do it even with things like philosophy, not just things like food and water and mating, like an animal will, but we're also going to do it with things like love and philosophy and community and society and et cetera, et cetera. You follow? That's natural. We need to see patterns. Our brains are made to see patterns. So it's good to essentialize stuff. But when you essentialize things and lump them all together in a category, you have to cut corners because not everything is an exact carbon copy of everything else. There's always going to be a little bit of nuance when you're studying a group of phenomena. Do you guys follow that? You get that? Like, for instance, you could talk about the systemic racism in our country, which targets people of color, that, exists in all strata of society. And, therefore, all black, usually the darker your skin color is, the more you're discriminated against. Right? However, if you look at Kanye West's children, for instance, who I think, they're definitely qualify as black, right? I don't know what percentage Kanye is, but you look at his kids and they definitely qualify for whatever that je ne sais quoi thing is that makes somebody black. they don't experience the same systemic racism that other people within the black community do. So you can make an argument for systemic racism, that our country was built on slavery, that black people have been disenfranchised for as long as you can remember, that it's like practically woven in their DNA, that they grow up disadvantaged. Like, all that's true. And there's exceptions to the rule where people are just, in this country, royalty. Beyonce's kids. Will Smith's kids. Have they experienced racism? For sure. 100%. Yes. Have they experienced the same level of racism as, I don't know, some super impoverished person growing up in the Deep South? No. You guys follow this? So you want to make a blanket statement, and I'm picking a blanket statement that like kind of nobody wants to disagree with ever anymore. You follow? And by the way, I'm building on the work of Dr. David Pilgrim, who's black and is at Ferris University and curates the Museum of Racism. He's a very, very well-respected sociologist, professor. Who's dedicated his life to studying racism. He was criticized. He has in his museum, he's been collecting racist memorabilia and paraphernalia from all over the world, and he has a whole museum of it. I believe it's being hosted at Ferris University, which is up in Michigan right now. And somebody wrote in, and they're like, why do you have racist stuff against white people in there? Cracker, white trash, redneck, because he's got some of that kind of memorabilia in there. And they said, don't you know that racism can only exist if it's systemic and it's a majority group that has power and a hegemonic relationship with the minority group and is therefore capable of enacting policy that's punishes. And and so you've heard this argument for like what is required. And so Dr. David Pilgrim goes, yeah, he goes, listen, here's what happened. I read Martin Luther's letter from the Birmingham jail. It was some letter that Martin Luther King wrote. It's like a great American letter. It's really good. And he says, a threat to equality anywhere is a threat to equality everywhere. I believe is the exact verbatim quote. And he said, the first time I really read that, it changed my life. And I started incorporating racist memorabilia against Asian people and white people along with. He said, let me tell you my story. I grew up in the Deep South. And when I grew up, I was sent to a desegregated school. I think it was in Alabama. But the desegregation of schools legally was in 1954 because it's illegal to not provide education, discriminate in terms of providing education. But that was de jure, that was by law. The de facto desegregation of schools took place decades later, especially in the Deep South, where people just decided we're not going to desegregate. The school I went to growing up was like 40% Mexican, like 30% black, and 30% white. It was a bus-in schooling program, so kids would get bussed in. They'd have to drive an hour to get to my school in my neighborhood. But we ended up going to a school because they filled up the schools, because they just had those schools in the inner city way overcrowded, and then our schools are super bougie, even though they're public, because there's a much lower population density, so they would bus kids in. Are you guys aware of this? I'm sure it's still going on now. And so the result of that was I grew up in a super, like melting pot, school. But that took decades to happen after legally schools were desegregated. So when the professor was going to school it was the first year they desegregated these schools in Alabama. Pritchard, it was called Pritchard High, somewhere in the deep South. And he's walked to school every day because they were too poor to ride in a car. They had to walk through a white neighborhood on the way to school. And rocks would get thrown at them every day. They'd get chased. They'd throw rocks back. They'd fight back. And it was like a battle zone just getting to school every day. And the white kids there hated them, and they hated the white kids. And he said that those white kids, they were hated by the rich white community as much as black people were. In fact, they were called white, fill in the blank. Because they were super poor, and they lived a very impoverished, very destitute, in his own words, pathetic life. And so he said, as far as he could see, those people, because they were impoverished, they were seriously discriminated against. So if you define racism as a society-wide phenomenon that requires money and numbers, then yeah, you can make this argument. But I mean, there's the term systemic racism because you need an adjective to modify the word racism. If you ignore the fact that racism is motivated by hate at its core, and it's not merely a system, an abstract, meaningless system that has nothing behind it. If you ignore the fact that behind those systems is a condescension and a feeling of superiority and a hatred of the other, whatever that other may be, you've actually missed the whole point. And so racism begins on an individual level because we're human beings. And when you get a group of people together doing things systemically, guess what had to happen before you got together and did a group doing things systemically? You had to have people doing things individually. And then enough of those individuals got together and they created a systemic thing. So the actual core of any systemic racism is individual racism. You follow? And if a black person murders a white person because he's white, is that racist? You damn straight it's racist. If 10 black people get together, take advantage of 2 white people because they can do that on that small community scale, is that racist? Sure it is. Is it communal? Yeah, it is. Can as much damage be done? No. If you got the guns and the money and the numbers, you can do more damage. But he made this brilliant argument that behind any abstract system you want to talk about is individual hatred of one individual for another. And I saw that towards white people in my youth. And therefore, when I read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, where he wrote a threat to freedom anywhere, equality anywhere, is a threat to equality everywhere. He goes, I realized I had to include memorabilia for racism across the board, even against white people. Do you follow this? It's such a checkmate move. I just couldn't. I mean, when I read his rebuttal, I was just like floored. There's value in noticing the individual specifics of any given circumstance. But we can't only do that because then we can't see patterns and learn, and we're going against our own brain chemistry, and you won't be able to get very far, and you got to reinvent the wheel every single day of your life. So you got to find this thing where you can merge without mush, where you can find threads of continuity and heuristics and rules of thumb and things which tend to be principles which govern many things, and at the same time make room for the individual specifics of whatever circumstance you're looking at. And that's the magic. And polarity management. Because each thing requires you to sort of ignore the other, and so you have to be deft, and you have to have a deft touch and dexterous, and you have to be able to navigate between those two things. If you can walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, as one famous poet said, you can walk with kings without losing the common touch. this ability to see the specifics and see the generalities. And so a lot of times when people want to say religions all have the same core, what they really want to do is tell you what they like and ignore what they don't. And that's what I have an issue with. Because there's something special about the specifics of a tradition. For example, if we just define Christianity as like, Christ was a guru, and he led his tribe, and he was a revivalist, and he took the 10 Commandments and made them into 2, and he suffered religious persecution for a great cause, and he forgave his enemies. You're good. Just keep doing your thing. And he forgave his enemies, right? If you do this, you miss the core Christian idea. Right or wrong, you miss the core idea in the Nicene Creed. That Jesus died on the cross to pay for the sins of mankind as God's gift to the world, because the sins of the world became too great. Someone had to pay the blood debt. And so Jesus suffered literally and redeemed and suffered on behalf of every single human being. That may be a smart idea. I mean, it may be a terrible idea. I mean, it's based on this idea that you can pay somebody else's debt. Like you can, it's actually linked to slavery. You used to have slaves, and if you got punished, and it was like Ross gets 50 lashings, and Nick was Ross's slave, and then Ross could be like, "Hey Nick, go take those lashings for me." And Nick could be like, "All right, boss." And then we lashed Nick, and that's the same as lashing Ross, and you're good. I mean, basically, the entire modern legal system is pointing out the fundamental illogic and inhumanity of such ideas about justice. But, exempting that huge, glaring defect. You follow? The whole idea of Jesus being the one Son of God who suffered and was capable, had a big enough heart to suffer for everybody. It was actually God suffering for us and paying our debt. That is so intrinsic to the Christian revelation. And it's specific, man. There are common points with other traditions. There's similar ideas in other traditions. But that's really its own special thing. And by attempting to reduce that and fit a square peg into a round hole, you end up cutting off the head of the goose that laid the golden egg. Not that we eat eggs, but it's an oldie but a goodie. And so there is a time to appreciate the individual revelation of a given tradition. What's special about a particular martial art? What's unique about it? And not be afraid to acknowledge that there might be special things about every tradition. I'm looking for the common points. I'm looking for stuff that I see across a wide array of traditions. Doesn't have to be across every tradition. I don't need to fit like everything. I'm not a reductionist. But I'm not so contrary that I refuse to be a human being and notice patterns. And make, kind of a sexy argument that like everything just is what it is and you don't need to compare it to anything else. And any type of, literary theory, any type of interpretation, any type of lens you put on anything is adulteration, and you should just be and allow, just like each experience to be unique in its own and not notice any patterns and just essentially fight your humanity, fight really biology. Like not even humanity, it's like even like all biology has this in common. So you gotta fight fundamental biology and the specific thing that makes human beings brilliant and apex predators. because you refuse to notice patterns, or I'm going to notice those patterns and then lose my ability to appreciate the specifics. Did you follow this? So, I take people to India. Like my man's going to India with me for the first time in his life. Never been to India. You ever been to India? Okay. Dhameshwar, born Hare Krishna. Narayan, born Hare Krishnas. But these, like, they're kind of like the white trash version of like... that I grew up in a trailer park and like, you know, they've never been outside of like the 5 boroughs, and it's just kind of like, that's the thing. I'm just kidding. Not really in your case, but whatever. So, I can throw that kind of shade to my right. And so, they've never been to India. I've been to India like 50 times. I lived there for years and years. So I did it different. And there's something special about going to our sacred places. Now, I'm not saying there's not something also special about doing the Hajj and going to Mecca. I'm not saying there's not something special about that. Or going to the Holy Land and going back to Jerusalem. I'm not against other traditions also having their sacred spaces. And their sacred spaces are intimately linked to their specific revelation, which has some things in common with global religion, but also has some special things. It's got some special stuff going on too. And our tradition does too. And our tradition is intimately linked to our theology. We want to go to a forest to encounter God in an intimate form. Krishna doesn't even wear jewels. He's wearing a peacock feather. You know where you get peacock feathers? Just on the forest floor. If you're in the forest, there's peacock feathers. They're these beautiful feathers, but they're just all over the forest floor. Krishna wearing a peacock feather, it's very subversive. It's an anti-deity. Instead of wearing a crown, he's wearing a peacock feather. Instead of wearing jewels, he's wearing a garland made of forest flowers. Just right there, just all over the place. Nothing special. Our whole conception of divinity requires you to go to a forest bower, a romantic place, so you can meet the transcendental Cupid. That's our holy places. They're linked intrinsically and innately and intimately to our theology. Maybe chanting the holy name. There was a sect of Christian monks, and they said that the holy name was Christ. And the Russian government sent soldiers, and they killed them in Greece about 100 and some odd years ago. Anyway, if you dig deep into the theology, they didn't have the same conception that God was his holy name that we have. It was different. But it was similar, and I can appreciate the parallels. But every tradition ultimately ends up being somewhat unique when you really dig into it. When you really dig into it, you see those beautiful threads of continuity, and those things are beautiful, and then you also see the special things about a given tradition. And you're not threatened by them, and you don't have to dismiss them. You can actually appreciate them. Really, if you found a good tradition, they just make you appreciate your own tradition more. You think of how amazing your deity is, that he manifested, she manifested to different people in different places, in different times, according to their qualifications and their desires. And then you see the specialness of the revelation that you received. And it makes you love Krishna even more. There's something special about our tradition. Which is why when our tradition breaks it down, there's 5 things. Out of the unlimited items of bhakti, 64 items are important. From another map, 9 items are important. Within those 64 items, and even those 9 items, 5 have been selected to be the most important. What are they? All right, 1. Nam Kirtan, yeah. Huh? Bhagavat Shravanam, hearing the Bhagavatam. Hearing the Bhagavatam, not just hearing the Bhagavatam, which is a text which actually just tells you stories about how beautiful and wonderful Krishna is, ultimately, because philosophy can't do it justice. And so ultimately, at some point, you got to just tell a story, because that's what stirs your heart. Bhagavat Shravan, Nam Kirtans. 2. That's right. Mathura Vas. Going to Vrindavan. Not just visiting holy places, going to Vrindavan.
In the company of devotees?
Huh?
In the company of devotees?
Yeah. Vaishnav Seva.
Worshipping the deity?
That's right. Sri Murti Seva. You got to associate with Vaishnavas, with devotees. You got to serve the deity. That's something special about our tradition. Our idea of deity worship. It's also linked to our idea of dressing Krishna, playing with Krishna, and dancing with Krishna, and getting you oriented towards that. The Bhagavatam, the holy name. Not just any holy name. We can't just chant Ishwar, Ishwar. We chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. That sweet Madhur Nam, that sweet intimate name of divinity, makes you fall in love with Krishna. Masculine, feminine, conjugal name. In separation. Radha and Krishna coming together. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, and they're separated. Hare Ram, they're together again. Ram Ram, Hare Hare, and they're separated again. Our conception of separation and union, of masculine and feminine divinity, of an intimate divinity, of crying out to that divinity in love, that's in our mantra. It's not just any name. It's not just any place, it's our place. It's not just any deity, it's our deity. It's not just any devotee, it's our tribe. You guys follow that? It doesn't make you a bigot, doesn't make you unenlightened, doesn't make you unintelligent. In fact, when you try to fit all religions into a petri dish for studying by lopping off various limbs and getting just down to their essential core. It's like some kind of biopsy. You actually offend that tradition. You think you know that tradition better than the insiders. And you get to reduce it and essentialize it. You follow? And you deny that there might have actually been a special revelation. Somebody might actually have a vision of truth. And that the billions of people who follow a tradition might actually be onto something. And so we need to appreciate the things that all traditions have in common, that many traditions have in common, or that several traditions have in common, or that all traditions should have in common. Slice it how you want to. We can go the other way. All traditions should have this in common. And if you don't, you got a glaring deficit in your tradition. And we can have that argument, a comparative religious argument. If your religion eats meat, you've blown it. I'm going to stop you at the door. I'll come talk to you outside. You don't get to come inside. You follow? It's like you got a bunch of stool on your shoe. It's like you're not a bad person, but it's like we got to deal with that. It's a problem. Needlessly causing suffering to God's creatures for the satisfaction of your tongue for no good reason. You must have a dystheistic conception of divinity, an evil God conception of divinity, or some other kind of serious personality disorder, religious personality disorder, RPD. Something fundamentally is wrong with your wiring. We got to get that sorted out. You can even take I've discovered the essence of traditions, and your traditions didn't have this essence, therefore we got a problem. You can go that route. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So whether you're finding what all religions have in common, you are finding a list of essentials that every worthwhile tradition should have in common, you follow? Or things that many traditions have in common, or that several traditions have in common, or that two traditions have in common, or that's special about your tradition and unique about your tradition. And then you can honor something unique about another tradition and hear a story from another tradition and be like, wow, that's beautiful. Or you can be like, wow, there's something fundamentally wrong with that. Like that whole thing of having somebody else pay for your sins. I think that's fundamentally flawed. Or that God needed suffering in the first place. That somehow or other the debt was like greater than God. And the debt had to be paid. And that we could only become cured by seeing somebody bleed. It's not that Christ happened to bleed, but we could have heard his message, but he bled and we listened. That's not it. He had to bleed and nobody could learn without him bleeding. For God to create a universe like that would mean there's something wrong with God. Because he certainly could have created a universe where somebody didn't have to bleed in order for someone to learn. You can critique. You can compare. You can be the loyal opposition. Look at our own tradition. You can have doubts about your own tradition. So I think there's value in looking for those common points. I think beyond there being value, I think it's human to do so. I think it's also kind of just simply biological to do so. We are made to notice patterns. We are made to notice common points. We are made to see what's really going on. And so we should. And we should also leave enough room to be able to appreciate the specialness of a given tradition. And not just your own. Not be hypocritical. Let people paint you a picture. And straddle that divide, bridge that gap, manage those polarities of being able to appreciate the essence of all things while at the same time being able to appreciate the specialness of each individual thing. And amazingly, you ready for this? Here we go. Presto. You ready? That actually works really nice with Martin Luther King's statement. A threat to equality anywhere is a threat to equality everywhere. Because you have to ultimately do things one person at a time, one interaction at a time, one conversation at a time, one page at a time, one idea at a time. You need to learn the art of engaging with individual circumstances, individual instances of racism, if you're going to deal with the systemic problems of racism. Individual instances of beauty and truth, if you're going to be able to appreciate systemic areas of truth. And so while we look for patterns, we can never forget that the only way we get to those patterns is by having a bunch of data that we closely look at, that we investigate, that we engage with. And so even though we're made to see patterns, the only way you get to good patterns is when you are present in each individual conversation and you honor each tradition and each phenomenon and each stuff that you look at. How do we know that all men are mortal? Because we hung out with a lot of people, and we notice everybody kicks a bucket at some point. And at a certain point, you're like, hey, it seems like everybody grows old and dies. Have you ever seen anybody who doesn't grow old and die? You're like, no, I haven't. And she's like, I heard of somebody. And you're like, let's go find that guy. And we find out he doesn't exist. And I'm like, anybody else? Everybody's like, no, it's like my experience. I'm like, all right, can we vote on it? And so ideas like the whole ocean is salty come from individual experiences of ocean water over and over again, such that you're justified in making that sweeping statement, because deductive logic always comes from induction, from inference, from building from a specific experience, which is, by the way, why they say sat asat in Sanskrit. They say effect cause, not cause and effect. Because although the cause precedes the effect chronologically in universal time, your experience of the effect precedes your recognition of an ultimate cause in real life. And therefore, from the point of view of the investigator, it's inference and then deduction. Effect, then cause. And so although we should appreciate the general truths and the general principles, and we should look for patterns and not turn off our brain, that should never be at the expense of connecting with the individual. Do you guys follow that? Was that cool? That was a little mic drop moment there. Did you guys catch it? Wrap it all up with a bow tie? All right. Should we cancel IGTV and say adios? Adios, amigos, on IGTV. What do you got? Give me some feedback.